It all started with something so trivial, so clearly unimportant, that I still can't believe it caused everything to unravel. I was folding laundry in the living room when Jake called from the hallway. "Lorraine, could you assist me with this?" I turned to see him standing by the stairs, struggling with his belt buckle. He was wearing khaki shorts that hung loosely around his waist, and the leather strap of his belt was tangled uncomfortably. "Can you fix it?" he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's stuck or something." "Sure," I replied, setting the folded towels aside. I moved closer, reaching for the belt and trying to untangle the strap from the clasp. "Almost there," I muttered. "Sorry," he said, holding his breath as I worked. But when I tugged at the leather, the buckle gave way, and before either of us could react, his shorts slid down to his ankles. Everything seemed to stop. My eyes instinctively dropped to the sight, and a sudden impulse surged through me, taking everything in before I quickly looked away. Jake stood motionless, his hands hovering awkwardly, and his face turned red. Sorry," he mumbled, immediately yanking his shorts back up. I stepped back, my cheeks burning, and stammered, "It's okay." "Yes, it happens," he replied, his voice strained. "Thanks for your help." Without another word, he rushed upstairs, leaving me there, heart racing, mind spinning. It was just an accident, a fleeting moment of awkwardness, but the electric energy in the room and the way his gaze lingered on mine as he walked away shifted something. We never spoke of it, but our relationship was never the same afterward. My marriage to Alan wasn't a typical love story. It wasn't terrible either, just a comfortable, peaceful arrangement that had lost its warmth over time. We married when I was 44 and he was 50, both coming out of failed first marriages. Alan was a man of routine and interests: golf on Saturdays, monthly fishing trips, and an endless series of client dinners that kept him out late most evenings. I had learned to embrace the silences between us, filling my days with volunteer work, gardening, and household chores. Then Jake moved in. Alan's son from his previous marriage had always been polite but distant toward me. I'd only seen him a few times in the early years of our marriage, during mandatory holiday visits when he was still in college. He was very reserved back then, and it was always uncomfortable when young men are forced to share rooms with their new stepmothers. But 6 years later, the young man who arrived at our door was no longer the shy teenager I remembered. Jake had just graduated and was struggling to find his way in the world. His degree in fine arts, still scoffed at, hadn't brought him quick success, so Alan offered him a place to stay until he got things sorted out. I wasn't consulted about this arrangement, though I didn't object. The house was big enough to accommodate him, and I didn't mind the company during Alan's long workdays or evenings with friends. What I hadn't expected was how quickly Jake's presence changed the atmosphere of the house. He seemed uneasy, but had a natural charm that drew people to him. His humor was dry but disarming, and his smile was infectious. His presence filled the empty spaces of the house in a way Alan's never did. It all started with small moments. One morning, I was trimming the bushes in the backyard when Jake came out, barefoot and disheveled from sleep, holding a cup of coffee. He leaned against the patio door, smiling lazily as he watched me work. "You're up early," I commented, eyeing him. He shrugged and took a sip of his coffee. "Couldn't sleep. Besides, someone has to appreciate all the work you're putting in out here." I laughed softly and shook my head. "Don't let Alan hear you say that. He thinks this garden takes care of itself." Jake chuckled. "Alan doesn't notice much." Though surprised, I didn't question him, simply continuing to prune, acutely aware of his gaze. Over the following weeks, our conversations grew longer, and our interactions developed a natural rhythm. Jake would hang out in the kitchen while I cooked, sharing stories about his college days or asking for help with job applications. One day, I found him stretched out on the living room couch, doodling in a sketchbook. "Mind if I take a look?" I asked, nodding toward the notebook. He hesitated for a moment before handing it to me. The pages were filled with intricate pencil drawings, portraits, landscapes, and abstract designs that seemed to move with life. "These are amazing," I said sincerely. "Thanks," he murmured quietly. "I just do it to pass the time." "You should show these to someone," I suggested. "A gallery or an art director." "Jake, you have real talent." He gave a faint smile, meeting my eyes. You're the first to say that. The weight of his words lingered between us, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't identify. Then the belt incident happened, and everything changed. For several days, there was an unspoken tension in the air, heavy with a strange energy neither of us knew how to address. I tried to avoid being alone with him as much as possible, but the house was too quiet, and there were too many moments for us to accidentally cross paths. One evening, as I was washing dishes, Jake entered the kitchen. His hair was damp from a shower. He spoke softly, "Lorraine?" I turned, my pulse racing at the way he said my name. "Yeah?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of nervousness. He hesitated, hands shoved into his pants pockets. "I'm sorry for what happened the other day." "It's fine," I replied quickly, turning back to the sink. "Let's forget about it." "I'm not sure I can," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I froze, the weight of his words settling over me. I slowly turned to face him, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. "Jake, we can't." I started, but I wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. He moved closer, his gaze unwavering. "I know, but I don't want you to think it was meaningless to me," he said, his voice so intense that it left me speechless. Neither of us moved for a while. Alan's voice rang out from the front door, shattering the moment. "I'll be right there," I called out hastily, stepping away from Jake. But even as I walked off, I knew something had shifted between us, something irreversible. The days that followed were a chaotic mix of avoidance and fleeting glances. Despite his indifference, Alan spent his evenings watching TV or hanging out with friends, leaving Jake and me to navigate the tangled situation we had created. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry in the guest room, Jake appeared at the door. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice uncertain. I paused before nodding. "Close the door." He stepped inside and slammed the door behind him. "I'm not sure how to act around you anymore," he admitted, his voice raw. "Jake, we need to let this go," I said, my voice trembling. "It was just a moment." "But it wasn't just a second," he countered, stepping closer. "At least not for me." His words lingered in the air, and for the first time, I allowed myself to face the truth. It wasn't just a fleeting moment for me. There comes a point when you realize you're about to cross a line and there's no going back. I knew it the first time Jake kissed me. None of this was planned. It happened late one evening after Alan had been out at a poker game with his golf buddies. I was in the kitchen cleaning the countertops when Jake entered. "Can't sleep?" I asked, glancing at him. "Something like that," he mumbled, leaning against the doorframe. He was barefoot, his hair disheveled, and his posture made my heart tighten. We stood there in silence for a moment, the only sound the quiet hum of the refrigerator. When I finally looked up, the intensity in his eyes left me speechless. "Lorraine," he said softly, stepping forward. "Jake, don't," I whispered, even as my heart raced. "I can't stop thinking about you," he murmured steadily. "You have to," I said, my voice shaking. "This is wrong, you know that." "I know," he murmured, closing the distance between us, "but that doesn't change how I feel." Then he kissed me. It was tentative at first, as though he was waiting for me to push him away, but I didn't. I couldn't. When I finally pulled back, my heart was pounding, and I couldn't meet his gaze. "This can't happen again," I whispered, barely audible. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe it. Neither did I. The following days were a blur of stolen moments and silent torment. We tried to pretend nothing had changed, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch felt electrifying, weighed down by all the words left unsaid. Alan remained blissfully unaware, absorbed in his job, friends, and hobbies. Despite his distractions, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were risking everything. The second time it happened was in the garden. I had been trimming the roses all morning, the warm sun on my back, when Jake appeared behind me. "You're always out here," he remarked, breaking the silence. "It's peaceful," I replied without turning around. He took a step closer, casting his shadow over me. "I guess you like avoiding me." My breath caught, but I kept my composure. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Don't you?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. I turned to face him and my chest tightened when our eyes met. This time, there was no hesitation, no way to argue my way out of it. He kissed me again, and I kissed him back. What started as fleeting moments gradually became something neither of us could stop. At first, we were cautious, seeking secluded spots in the house where we wouldn't be disturbed. But the more time we spent together, the more confident we became. While Alan was at a client dinner, Jake and I found ourselves in the library. I was pretending to organize the bookshelves, my hands trembling as he stood behind me. "You're shaking," he said gently, his breath warm against my neck. "I'm fine," I replied, but my voice betrayed me. He placed his hands on my shoulders, turning me to face him. "You don't need to be afraid," he said softly. "I'm not afraid of you," I whispered. "I'm afraid of what we're doing." He cupped my face in his hands, looking me in the eyes. "Then don't think about it. Just be with me." I wanted to argue, to tell him we couldn't keep doing this, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I let him pull me into his arms, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. The secret of our relationship only intensified its power. Each stolen minute felt like a rebellion against the life I had settled into, a reminder that passion still existed beneath the surface of my mundane marriage. But with the joy came fear. One afternoon, as Jake and I sat on the couch in the living room, Alan came home earlier than expected. "Lorraine," he called from the hallway. My pulse raced, and Jake quickly moved to the other side of the room. "In here," I called back, trying to sound steady. Alan walked in and glanced between us. "I had no clue you'd have visitors," he responded, his tone indifferent, though his gaze lingered on Jake. Jake replied casually, "Just catching up." His posture relaxed. Alan nodded, but the look he gave me as he walked away sent a chill through me. Despite our best efforts, it became harder to conceal things. Alan started asking questions, initially subtle, but slowly becoming more direct. "You and Jake seem to be getting along well," he remarked one evening as we sat at the dinner table. "Jake's been a huge help around the house," I said, forcing a smile. Alan nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm glad to see that," he said. "It's comforting to know someone is keeping you company while I'm working." His words carried an undertone I couldn't quite place, and I felt a wave of discomfort. The first real breach occurred when Jake's best friend Grant made an unexpected appearance. Grant was blunt, opinionated, and had a knack for sensing what others tried to hide. "You've been spending a lot of time at home," Grant remarked to Jake one afternoon, his tone light but his gaze sharp. Jake answered casually, "Just helping out." "Must be nice," Grant commented, his attention shifting to me. "Having someone to keep you company." His words sent a shiver through me, and I quickly excused myself, leaving them alone. Later, Jake found me in the kitchen, his expression serious. "Grant's starting to suspect," I said quietly, my voice trembling. Jake shook his head. "He's not clueless, Lorraine. He's going to figure it out." As the weeks went by, despite my trembling voice, the tension inside the house grew unbearable. Grant's remarks and the weight of our secret made the atmosphere feel heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Yet, as the risks escalated, so did my feelings for Jake, and no matter how dire things became, I couldn't bring myself to let him go. Keeping a secret felt like trying to breathe underwater. You can only manage for so long before the pressure becomes too much. Jake and I were skilled at hiding things, but the cracks in our facade were widening. Neither Alan nor Grant was oblivious. Then there was Heather, Alan's colleague, whose casual visits became more frequent and intrusive. Heather would drop by on Saturdays, unannounced, yet entirely at ease. She had visited several times before, usually under the pretense of delivering something for Alan. This time, she arrived with a bottle of wine and a wide grin. She walked into the kitchen where I was chopping vegetables and said, "I thought I'd stop by. Alan mentioned you've been feeling a bit overwhelmed lately, so I thought you might need a break." "I'm fine," I said with a strained smile. "But thank you." Heather set the bottle on the counter and leaned against the island, her gaze sweeping the room as if she were memorizing every detail. "This place is beautiful," she said. "You've done an amazing job making it feel like a home." "Thank you," I replied firmly. Her eyes lingered on the back door where Jake had just left. "Alan is lucky to have you," she continued. "And Jake, of course. He's been a tremendous help around here, hasn't he?" My heart raced, but I kept my composure. "He's been great. It's helpful to have him around." Heather's smile curled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure it is." Heather's visits became more frequent as time passed. She always had a reason to stop by, usually under the guise of work, but her true intentions were obvious. She was searching for something. However, I couldn't tell whether she was after information or Alan himself. One afternoon, while we sat in the living room, she casually remarked, "Alan doesn't talk much about his personal life, but I get the sense things haven't been going well between you two." I tensed, gripping the teacup in my lap. "Every marriage has its challenges," I said, trying to maintain my composure. "Oh, I know," Heather responded, her voice tinged with feigned sympathy. "But having Jake around really helps, doesn't it? He seems to be paying a lot of attention." The implication was clear, and I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. Then there was Grant again. Jake's closest friend, always direct, but suddenly his words took on a sharper edge. "You've been spending a lot of time with Lorraine," Grant commented to Jake one evening as they sat on the terrace, beers in hand. Jake shrugged, keeping his tone casual. "She's my stepmother. Of course we talk." "Yeah, but it's more than that, isn't it?" Grant pressed, his gaze piercing. Jake tightened his grip on the bottle. "What exactly are you implying?" Jake asked, his voice colder. "I'm saying you're acting strange, and it's not just because of work. There's something else going on, and I think it's about her." Jake stood abruptly, knocking his chair against the stone. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Don't I?" The tension in the house became unbearable. Every interaction with Alan felt like walking on a tightrope, and every visit from Heather was a looming challenge. Jake's frustration with our secret grew, and one evening, as we sat in the library, he turned to me, his expression hard. "I can't keep doing this," he said. "Jake, we have to be cautious," I responded, my voice trembling. "Cautious isn't enough," he replied. "Grant's suspicious, Heather's snooping around, and Alan isn't as naive as you think." I looked away, tears welling up in my eyes. "What do you suggest, that we stop?" He asked gently, his voice softening. "I can't manage it, but we need to figure out what we're going to do because this isn't viable." The tipping point happened during a dinner gathering that Alan insisted on hosting. Heather was there, naturally, along with some of Alan's colleagues. Jake had invited Grant, who showed up as well. The evening started off innocently enough, with polite conversation, laughter, and the clinking of wine glasses. However, as the night wore on, the mood shifted. "Lorraine," Heather called out, her voice cutting through the chatter, "how do you keep yourself busy with Alan gone so often?" I froze at her question, thick with implication. "The usual," I replied, keeping my voice light, gardening, reading, and helping Jake with various projects. Heather's smile tightened. "You must be quite close now." Across the table, Grant raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting to Jake. "Yeah, Jake's been spending a lot of time here lately. I suppose it makes sense. Lorraine is pretty easy to talk to." The table fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Alan looked back and forth between us, his expression unreadable, while Heather took a sip of her wine, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Jake pushed his chair back abruptly. "Excuse me," he muttered before leaving the room. "I'll go check on him," I said immediately, standing up before anyone could stop me. I found Jake in the yard, pacing beneath the soft glow of the patio lights. As I approached, he spoke. "This is a mistake." "What is?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Everything," he said, his voice thick with anger. "Letting Grant come here, pretending everything's fine. It's not. It's falling apart." I reached for him, my fingers grazing his arm. "We'll work it out," I said. He looked at me, despair in his eyes. "How? I'm running out of ways to hold it all together." Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps on the gravel made us both stop. I turned to see Alan standing at the garden's edge, his face obscured, but his posture tense. "What's going on out here?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. Alan stood at the lawn's edge, his body stiff under the dim patio lights. Jake was right next to me, and a heavy silence filled the air. My mind raced for something, anything, to say to break the tension. "Alan," I started, trying to force a smile, "we were just talking." He interrupted, his tone stern as he stepped closer, his gaze shifting between me and Jake. "It's interesting how you two seem to have so much to talk about lately." Jake tightened his jaw, standing straight. "Is there a problem?" Alan curled his lips into a cold smile. "I'm not sure. Should there be, Jake?" The impact of his words hit me like a punch, and my breath caught. This was no longer just suspicion, he knew. "I think I'll go inside," Jake said, his voice firm but strained. No, Alan snapped, leaving no room for argument. You'll stay right here. Jake paused but didn't move. Alan turned his attention to me, his eyes dark. Can you explain why my wife and child are sneaking around in the yard during a dinner party? I opened my mouth, but no words came. The tension rose. The following day, Alan was colder than ever, his jaw clenched, his icy demeanor making it clear he wasn't letting this go. Jake tried to distance himself, but that only made matters worse. Heather, of course, found a way to insert herself into the drama. I couldn't help but notice the unease last night, she remarked, sipping her coffee in the kitchen. It was just a misunderstanding, I explained, trying to sound lighthearted. Heather tilted her head, her smile too sweet to be sincere. Of course, but Lorraine, you might want to be careful. Perceptions can be dangerous, especially in situations like this. Her words were a veiled threat, and I could tell she was enjoying every second of it. The real twist came later in the evening. Alan called me into the study, his demeanor calm but unsettling. I've been thinking, he said, reclining in his chair. Maybe it's time for some changes. Changes? I asked cautiously. Jake has been here long enough, Alan continued nonchalantly. I think it's time for him to move on, find his own place. My heart sank. He's still figuring things out, and he can do that somewhere else, Alan added sharply. This isn't up for discussion. When I told Jake, his reaction was explosive. Is he kicking me out? Jake's voice rose. Because of what? A conversation in the garden? Is he suspicious? Jake, I murmured, trying to stay calm. He thinks. He thinks what? Jake snapped. What's happening? This is his issue, not ours, I said, placing a hand on his arm, trying to calm him. We knew this was a possibility. We can't let it get worse. Jake shook his head, his jaw tight. He's not doing this because he's suspicious. He's doing this to control you, and I'm not going to let him. The night Alan urged Jake to leave was the beginning of the end. You have a week to pack your things, Alan said calmly during dinner, his tone firm. Jake's fork clattered onto his plate as he stood up quickly. You don't get to decide when I leave. This is my house. Alan's voice turned icy. I won't tolerate this any longer. What exactly are you tolerating? Jake shot back, his voice rising. I'm here, or I'm getting closer to Lorraine than you ever could. The room went still, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Alan's expression darkened as he stood, his voice low and menacing. Get out of the house before. I will make you regret it the night I discovered Jake in his room, his luggage halfway packed. You cannot allow him to triumph, he muttered, his voice strained with fury. This isn't about triumphing, I explained, my voice quivering. This is about survival. He turned to face me, his eyes aflame. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to stay with him. I have no choice, I said, tears flowing down my face. Jake stepped closer and said, There's always an option. Come with me. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I let myself imagine them, leaving everything behind and starting fresh somewhere far away. But the reality of what that meant hit me hard, and I shook my head. I can't, I spoke, my voice breaking. Jake stared at me for a long while before nodding. Then I'll go, he replied softly, but it's not finished. Jake had left the next morning. Alan didn't speak to me, so I spent the day wandering around the vacant house, unsettled by the quiet. But the real shock came that evening. I found a note pushed under my bedroom door. You think you've won, Alan, but you don't know the truth. I'll make sure you do. Heather. My hand shook as I read the note, its consequences sinking in. Heather knew she had seen or overheard something and was now using it to her advantage. Her message weighed heavily on my mind. I stood frozen in my bedroom, rereading the words until they blurred. My first instinct was to confront her and demand to know what she thought she had on me. But I already knew. She'd seen or heard enough to piece together something dangerous, and now she had full control. 2 days later, Heather returned, this time pretending to deliver some papers for Alan. I trapped her in the kitchen, my voice low and stern as I held up the note. What is this? I demanded, my hands shaking. Heather didn't flinch. Leaning against the counter, a small smirk on her lips, she responded, It's exactly what it says. Do you think Alan deserves to know the truth? There's nothing to discuss, I said quickly, though my voice trembled. Heather raised an eyebrow, her gaze filled with mock sympathy. Lorraine, you don't truly believe that, do you? I've seen the way you and Jake look at each other. I'm not blind. My chest tightened, and I moved closer, lowering my voice. If you think you can use this to manipulate me, you're wrong. I won't let you ruin my family. Heather chuckled quietly, shaking her head. Would you destroy your family, Lorraine? You already have. I'm just speeding up the inevitable. Before I could respond, Alan's voice echoed down the hallway, and Heather's grin widened. Don't worry, she said. I'll take care of things. That evening, Alan was quieter than usual, poking at his meal with a tense expression. Heather had left hours earlier, but her presence lingered like a shadow over the house. I didn't know if she had said something to him, but the silence between us was suffocating. Finally, Alan put down his fork and looked at me. Lorraine, is there anything you'd like to tell me? My heart stopped. I forced a smile, pretending confusion. What do you mean? Alan leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp. You've been acting strangely lately. And then there's Heather, who hints at things I don't understand. If there's anything going on, now is the time to tell me. Panic surged in my chest, but I kept my composure. Alan, there's nothing going on. Heather is just trying to stir up trouble. You know how she is. Alan stared at me for a long time before nodding slowly. I hope you're right, he said, his voice heavy with caution. Because if I find out otherwise... He didn't need to finish the sentence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. Heather's threat hung over me, and Alan's growing mistrust made every movement feel like it was one step closer to disaster. Then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, my phone rang on the nightstand. I grabbed it, my pulse racing as I read the message. Meet me tomorrow around noon by the bridge in the park. Jake? The next day, I left the house, pretending to run errands. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I drove to the park, my mind racing with what Jake might want to say. When I arrived, he was waiting by the bridge, his hands tucked in his jacket pockets. You shouldn't have come to me, I murmured as I walked up, my voice trembling. I didn't have a choice, he said, his eyes filled with anger. Heather came to see me, I gasped, and the ground seemed to shift beneath me. She knows, Lorraine, he said quietly, concern in his voice. She knows everything and is using it to get to Alan. My stomach twisted. What exactly did she say to you? She wanted me to confess, he said coldly, to tell Alan the truth. Lorraine, she's playing us both. I closed my eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. We're running out of time, I whispered. Jake reached for my hand and his touch grounded me. Then we need to act before she does.